Today we're going to have a conversation about ECG and the revenue question. But why is this important? Because in the last few days, you've noticed that Solon Asogli, that huge power plant, they've shut it down. And I want to show you that slide that talks about the significant amounts of power that we've lost as a result of this. And this is on the 8th of October, 2024. Solon Asogli power plant went down, and deliberately so, and we're losing some 560 megawatts of power because Solon Asogli went down. This is significant. A few reasons why this happened, and they've told us this. One is that inability to fund its operations. And when they say that, they in essence is saying that we are selling the power, but we're not getting enough back so we can run our operations. Every business, of course it's a business, must make revenue, and out of that, you can invest back in there, and then you can run. That is not happening. And why is this not happening? It's not happening because they say the ECG has failed to honor its revenue payments. Of course, ECG sells to all of us, and then they raise the revenue, raise the funds, and then they can pay the likes of Solon Asogli. But how much are we talking about? How much is it that is at stake here? We're talking about some $259 million in terms of the debt that they are owed. That is significant indeed. Now, but this is the Solon Asogli story. But a few other additional things that we're beginning to learn, because the Solon Asogli story is just a tip of a massive iceberg. And that's why we're having this conversation tonight, keeping the lights on, the ECG revenue question. Now, the Solon Asogli, for example, now points us to the potential source of the problem. The potential source of the problem is cash waterfall, and there's a gap in there that we're beginning to see. So, for example, only 22.6% of the invoices that Solon Asogli sent out to the authorities, the ECG, has been honored. Only 22.6% of the invoice has been paid. That obviously is definitely inadequate. And one of the things that we have realized as a result of this is that the ECG itself, and talking about the cash waterfall mechanism, collects quite a bit, but doesn't pay everything into the cash waterfall mechanism, right? And that for us is a very interesting revelation as we begin to study the documents that we begin to gather just to make sense of this Solon Asogli problem. And previously, you remember that the IPPs themselves as a group issued a statement threatening to shut down. Of course, that was averted. But to have one shutdown, it's been down for quite a while. Today, for example, we reached out to them to say, do you want to join us for a conversation? They said, well, they have been promised some money. If they receive the money, they will talk. If they don't receive the money, it's very difficult for them to speak because nothing has changed. But one of the key things that we realized is that ECG isn't paying everything they collect into the cash waterfall mechanism. And one of the important things is to begin to look a bit more into this is that ECG actually, since last year, has had a significant historic revenue jump. And I want to link this from what we're learning about the fact that they're collecting quite a lot, but not paying everything to the cash waterfall mechanism. And this slide here makes the point. And this, by the way, is according to the ECG's financial statement. Right? You can check it out yourself because it's there. If you look for it, you'll find it. ECG's financial statement from 2023 gives us a historic jump in revenue from some 8.69 billion to 15.75 billion. That is historic indeed. If you look at the trend over the period, that slide is important. That slide is important because it shows you that jump and how ECG is beginning to see some improvement, and not just some significant improvement in its revenues, right? And we are talking about some 81.27% increase in revenue. That 8 to 15 billion jump is 81.27 billion. And by the way, this is historic, right? And that tells you a story. Something is happening at the ECG, at least in 2023, according to the ECG financial statement and its annual report. If you pour through that, you'll see this jump from 2022 to 2023. So ECG is collecting, at least this is historic, if you look at the last many years, this hasn't happened before. In terms of that record jump, this is unprecedented. So one of the things that we decided to do is to now interrogate what happened last year that led to this record jump in revenue, right? Because if we can find that thing, then we can say, let's do more of that to keep ECG sustainably making revenue that it can pay Sono Asogli. And one of the first things that we realized is that something that happened last year significantly is the Haptel digitized revenue system that was fully plugged in early last year. And we find that this has a significant impact because one of the few things that this did is you take out the human element from the way ECG was raising revenue, chasing people, and people were dodging. Because of that human element, there was significant corruption. And by the way, remember that for us here at Multimedia, we commission investigations that actually revealed power theft at an extraordinary level. What the Haptel intervention did was to take out the human element significantly, and I'll show you additional slides that we are beginning to learn a bit more, that tells us that story. And so the Haptel intervention took out that human element, it digitized the process, makes it more efficient, more convenient for all of us to pay. No wonder we've seen that significant, historic, unprecedented 81% increase in revenue from 2022 to 2023. That 8 billion to that 15 billion CDs. It's never happened in a long, long time. Now, so you need to do more of the digitalization. You need to do more, not less, right? Something positive is happening there. And this is one of the key elements that happened last year. I'm talking about the Haptel digitized revenue system, full plug-in. Started sometime in tail end of 2022, but fully plugged in early 2023. And the ECG financial statement is capturing this record jump. And so that is something that we need to be doing more of and not less of, right? And then the second thing that we also saw, I mean, again, you're trying to understand what was happening there, because if you see that, call it an outlier in terms of the jump, you need to understand it. If you understand that, then you can say, let's do more of that. It's the fact that last year, the PULC also did tariff adjustments, right? And cumulatively, we calculated some 57.88% cumulative adjustment in tariffs last year. We had a 29% increase in the first quarter. Then you had an 18% increase in the second quarter. In the third quarter, there was a 4% increase. In the last quarter, there was actually a 1.5% decrease in tariff. If you put all together, we're calculating a cumulative tariff increase in percentage terms of 57.80%. Now, is this as significant as the digitalization of the process, making it more efficient, making it more convenient for you, into taking out the human element that led to the corruption that we expose here at Multimedia? Now, one of the reasons why this particular tariff adjustments over that period, you could say it's not as significant, because historically, if you study the trends, when tariffs are increased in the year, it tends to take, its impact on the revenues of ECG tends to take effect in the next year. So this happened in 2023. We're expecting its full impact in 2024. So that record revenue jump of 81% from 8 billion to 15 billion, right, cannot largely be attributed to this. Of course, it had an impact somehow, but it's not as significant, because historically, for a few reasons. One is the fact that, of course, as you know, the last quarter, it was a reduction. And then we have 3 quarters that do not always take effect immediately happen. So it takes time for its full impact to be felt. And historically, you see that in the next year. But another thing that we also saw is that another thing that actually increases when you see a tariff going up is ECG's debt. Why? Because walk through town, you see many commercial buildings that had meters in them that used to be occupied by businesses, that the businesses are no longer occupying the buildings. But the ECG is estimating those meters. So the ECG, those meters are still billable, but there's nobody there. So just adding on to the debt, you can collect it because there's nobody using that, right? And a lot of the buildings have that problem also. Some of the meters are not really working, but ECG is estimating them. You know it. I have been estimated many, many years. Although I left my old place and nobody there, I still see my bills in my inbox, but there's nobody there. That is debt on ECG's books. And so this line, the second point about the tariffs, we're expecting to see this year. And I'm going to show you another graph that is showing you the improvement in the revenues. And then, of course, if you don't forget, that third point there, when Dubik was here in the studio doing that revenue showdown, we call it, going around the country and collecting revenues, chasing people down, closing institutions that were failing to pay. Parliament went down, the stadium went down. It was really chasing people, right? And that, we see, had an impact, right? So you see that significant, and of course, people were paying and using the Haptel system to pay. So you're beginning to see that intervention always helps when it's done right. And the evidence is definitely in the numbers, from 8 billion to 15 billion. Now, I want to show you the historical analysis that we did that told us a bit of a story in terms of the numbers that we are seeing. And just look at this figure here for me, this 81% that we are talking about. And then you begin to go back to the other years. And this is all fundamentally based on the ECG's financial statement we've been studying over the years. And there's a lot in there, and I encourage you to look for it. In 2016, for example, the increase in revenue was just 5.7%. If you come to the 2017, you have 6.2%. If you come to 2018, there was a particular year that there was actually a decrease, right? And that was a decrease there. And these are in billions, by the way. And the percentage increases are not as significant as what we've seen over the last, in 2023. So you talk about 5.7 billion, 6.2 billion, 5.5 billion, 7.1 billion, nothing compared to 15 billion as recorded in 2023. That is why it is actually jaw-dropping. If you look at that revenue jump, it's actually jaw-dropping. And that is something that we noticed. 2022, 2021, we didn't see a financial report because obviously we are talking about they were just coming out of and still dealing with the privatization that we saw with the PDS, very controversial indeed. And then you come to the 2023 and just look at that red line there compared to what we see all the way there. This doesn't compare to any of that. And there's a reason why that happened, and that is what I've been explaining there. That number one element there is that Haptel, intervention that we saw in terms of all the revenue improvement that we see there. But another thing that we saw that was also fascinating. So we're talking about 15 billion. That brings us down to 1.3 billion monthly revenue that the ECG is raising. If you're just looking at the ECG financial statement, 1.3 billion, that is significant indeed. Now, this is the cash waterfall. And if you look at the PURC regulatory notices that they issued and the audit they've been doing over the last few years, ECG is declaring into the cash waterfall an average of 700 million. And you need to compare oranges and oranges, not apples and oranges. Because if you're looking at revenue, revenue says ECG is collecting significantly more revenue than is declaring into the cash waterfall mechanism. So if you look at 700 million on the average, that is they declared into the cash waterfall last year. October, for example, if you look at one of the reports from PURC, it was 700 million. But then we are telling you that based on the ECG's own financial statement, they were doing 1.3 billion on the average monthly. You see the gap there? Some 500 million. 500 million that if you don't track, you will notice that it's happening. But it's actually happening, that something has happened to the ECG. And the key point here is this difference here, right, to be more specific. So it's actually very significant in terms of where is this money is the question we are asking tonight. Why is the ECG not putting everything it's earning now on the back of all the interventions, including the very positive Haptel intervention? Why is it not putting everything into the cash waterfall mechanism? It is the reason why you will notice that the PURC has been chasing ECG and asking for some transparency when it comes to the cash waterfall mechanism. And you will notice also that even under the IMF program, there's a lot of push for ECG to be more transparent, to stop operating all these bank accounts and have one so we can monitor. But ECG has a reason. And when I sit down with my guest, we'll look at why ECG maybe has a case why you're not putting everything into the cash waterfall mechanism. But the thing that I want to stress, right, is that if you go and look at the cash waterfall mechanism alone, you will miss the significant job ECG is doing, at least based on this 2023 statement, in terms of the revenue, 1.3 billion, when they have been averaging at 700. And this is before the HAPTEL. And if you look at the before and after the HAPTEL, and this again tells the story. This is when HAPTEL fully plugged in, right? This in red here, that's when HAPTEL fully plugged in. This is before HAPTEL, 5.762 billion, etc. But then with full plugging, immediately to 15.7 billion, according to its own financial statement. So something was happening before that wasn't working. And now, obviously, is working, leading to this. And then you look at some of the specifics, and we wanted to isolate this just to, again, test the numbers a bit more. Now, look at the mobile app. And I use the mobile app, so I wanted to, again, get the data and try and understand what is happening. Look at this here, the deep blue line is giving you the 2023 numbers, and this is 2024 numbers, and this is 2023 numbers, right? But the 2024 numbers you see here. So you look at January in 2023, we are talking about 24 billion, right, coming in, and then look at this 24 million coming in, and look at what we are talking about here, just for the mobile app. 24 million, by the way. And look at the mobile app. It's telling you 255 for the same, if you compare the same periods over time, 255 million. If you look at February, we are at some 94. We are talking about some 250 million. So you begin to see that something significant has happened on the mobile app over the period. And collectively, we are talking about collections going up hugely over that particular period, comparing using the, and again, if you can look at the USSD also. The USSD is also telling us a significant change there between 2023 and 2024. And this is very current, by the way. You begin to see what is happening in USSD app. More people are using it, but ECG is collecting even more there. 16 million, say, in June. We are now talking about 46 million in the same period now this year. So something is happening significantly that is improving the revenues. Offline cashier monthly. Again, we're seeing the same thing here, right? Look at the numbers we are talking about here. For example, in January of 2023, we are doing 24. We are now doing 255. Significant amounts indeed. All showing that something is happening significantly, improving ECG's revenues. But I come back to the question I was asking. If ECG is making 1.2 billion monthly, but only putting in 700 million into the cash waterfall mechanism, where is the difference, and why? And why is ECG not putting all the money it's making, the revenue, into that, considering all the interventions they've done, including the HAPTEL intervention and everything else they put in? That question we'll answer when my guests join me for a conversation. Stay with me here on PM Express. And thanks for staying with us here on PM Express. My guest joining me in the studio for a conversation is Dr. Steve Mattel. And Dr. Steve Mattel is a man who understands the sector. He's been involved with the ECG for a very long time. He's also the co-chair of the Ghana Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. We'll also be speaking to a man who used to be at the PULC, Dr. Nidagwa Santis, a former PULC board member. He's been there, also understands this area very well. And stay with us here on PM Express. I want to start with you, Dr. Mattel. So when you look at the data, you look at the revenues, as I just talked about, what jumps at you? I mean, at least the ECG's own announced statement for 2023.
Well, Evans, for a person who is quite familiar with developments in the power sector, it doesn't come to me as a big surprise. The energy sector challenges has always been one of financial under recovery in terms of power distribution. And in the in time past, we seem to agree that we need some private sector intervention to be able to arrest the situation. And so you find that we tried the PD, as you mentioned it in your introduction. With all the controversies around PDS, at the time the contract was abrogated, they had actually shown substantial performance in terms of revenue collection. Even at that time, we also had BXC, a Chinese company that did some pilot in terms of revenue mobilization around the Teshinungwa, Maritime, Academy, and Dansoman areas, who also showed a lot of improvement in terms of the ability to mobilize revenues. And so, for me, it doesn't come as a huge surprise if we again went back to a private sector entity and we saw a jump in the revenues. What surprises me is the fact that less than, or roughly about 50% of the revenues generated is kept outside the cash waterfall mechanism, which is our innovation in terms of dealing and making sure that all the sector players get a fair share of what is owed them. I do not see the cash waterfall mechanism as a solution to the financial challenges facing the sector, but at least it helps to cushion everybody a little bit so that we can keep going. And so for so much money to be kept outside the cash waterfall mechanism, for me, is a bit worrying. But I do understand, because I'm quite privy to developments within the ECG sphere. ECG has time and again made the point that it needs to take care of its operational costs before depositing money into the cash waterfall mechanism. By this, they imply that, look, let us put the net after we've taken into account the cost of our operations. But it doesn't seem they've been heard. They've largely been ignored. And I think they found this innovative way of putting something aside and reporting only a paltry sum in the cash waterfall mechanism. That in itself also creates a problem, because then it raises questions as to the benefits of introducing a private sector entity to help with revenue assurance, because then we don't see the picture clearly in terms of what the contribution of that private sector entity, in this case, Hubtel, has been making to ensuring that we're able to mobilize enough to liquidate our debt in the sector. So it creates a problem, a credibility problem for that entity. But by and large, I think that the policymakers need to be engaging ECG and try to understand where the company is coming from, what are the challenges, so that we can accommodate them. I say this because we've had a similar challenge with GMPC. For a very long time, GMPC said, look, give us revenue recognition, because a time will come when we'll have to be on our own. So we need to build our balance sheet so that we can, in future, borrow money to finance operations on the strength of our balance sheet. They were ignored. And so GMPC was forced to go around the corner and find an innovative way of getting that revenue recognition through the JOHL arrangement, which we are all crying foul about. But if perhaps we had engaged the company and met the company halfway in terms of the concerns it was raising, perhaps we would have averted the situation. So in the same vein, I think that ECG has issues, and we need to engage them to see how we can accommodate some of the concerns they have. They believe that if they were to put all the money into the cash waterfall mechanism, they will not be able to raise enough revenue to finance their operations. Is it valid? Is it not valid? We need to investigate and try to engage them to come to some mutual accommodation.
Yeah, and you make the point about, but that also then doesn't give you full visibility on revenue performance.
Yes, that's the point. That's the other issue. And more importantly, it creates a credibility problem for the company that is helping us achieve these staggering revenue mobilization figures.
And then you look at the evidence, which is ECG's own financial statement. That actually shows that you make that intervention, because, again, we're interrogating. So what really led to this? In any research, when you see an outlier, you need to understand what is causing this problem. And then you go into it, the three elements that I sort of isolated. I mean, the Hubtel intervention, which you've mentioned. And then, of course, there was a tariff adjustment, cumulatively 57%. And then, of course, we saw that Dubik, when he was there, launched this revenue drive together thing. That first line appears to me to be sort of the as for the revenue, every now and then ECG, that's it.
Yeah.
Drive. And then the sub-tariff adjustment, there are major tariff adjustments, and of course the quarterly. That also happens. But the first time they plug in fully, then you see this jump. But you don't see it in what goes to the cash waterfall mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I mean, it was deliberate, no doubt about it. And the point I make is that, look, I'm mobilizing so much revenue, there's been a huge jump, but I need to make sure that I'm able to cover my costs. And so if the current arrangement does not allow me to cover my costs, then I begin to look for innovative ways. And I think PRC indicated some time back that ECG had opened several bank accounts in which it was putting various sums of money to hide it away from the cash waterfall mechanism thing. So they were actually directed to keep a single account.
Do you agree with that assessment that I was making, looking at the potential increase in the reasons for the reasons for the increase in the revenue, that you cannot dismiss the digitalized infrastructure that was rolled out, fully plugged in last year?
Oh, no, certainly it played a major role. I mean, if you look at where ECG was before the intervention, then of course you do the extrapolation and see what the growth trend has been. It's so clear that something must have happened. And if actually you take into account that there was this arrangement, and as I told you earlier, that for me it doesn't even come as a surprise, because anytime we've introduced a private sector participation in the last mile, in terms of the revenue assurance and revenue mobilization, we've always seen a jump. But this is quite astronomical. And I'm actually excited about it because, look, ideologically, I'm anti-privatization. Anti-privatization because, look, I believe the Ghanaian is capable to achieve what these multinationals come to claim they are able to achieve. Two, I do not believe...
Is this a Ghanaian intervention?
Oh, yes, of course. My church tells me that Capital is a Ghanaian company with a huge presence outside Ghana in the sub-region and beyond. But most importantly for me is the fact that you don't take a state monopoly and give to a private sector monopoly, especially multinationals. And so that's why I come to this discussion from a very ideological standpoint. I believe that it's better to have a Ghanaian entity if you have to do privatization, because whatever profit that entity makes remains within the Ghanaian economy. And if we have a Ghanaian that can give us a solution, why not? But for us, we need to also look at the cost and the benefit sides. How much has the company been able to add to our revenue? And what has the cost been? And what is the international, in terms of international best practice and benchmarking, how do we see the equation?
Considering what the financial statement says,
right,
and knowing where ECG is coming from, what's your answer to that question, if you're doing that cost-benefit analysis?
Well, if ECG was doing something in the region of 700 million cedis before the inception, monthly, before the inception, and now they are doing somewhere in 1.3 billion, then of course they've added about 600 and over million to the revenue. And so for me, if you were even taking 10% of the added revenue, that gives you about 60 million. I'm not too sure what the cost has been in terms of the real figures, but I'm saying that, look, there's been a certain jump in revenue which justifies the deal. I mean, because we're not doing very well before the inception of this particular arrangement.
And I'll come to Dr. Nidako Asante pretty shortly, former board member of PURC, who is joining us. Hello, Doc, can you hear me? Hello, Doc, can you hear me? Okay, please unmute for me. I know you are there, so I can hear your thoughts. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. I mean, you are PURC. I mean, give me your reaction to what we learned, that if you look at what is going to cash waterfall, but also look at ECG's own financial statement, this huge jump in revenue, but you don't see all that reflecting in the cash waterfall mechanism. I mean, is this something that has been the case in the past, and what has been, have you interrogated this in the past, and I guess, and what has been the official explanations, if you like, from ECG?
Well, good evening to to you and to your listeners. I think let me start by saying that what you're observing was expected to happen from day one when the cash waterfall was set up. It's not a surprise that matters got worse over time. So let me explain why I say that. Historically, ECG has shortchanged the sector in terms of revenue. So it collects from consumers, and then it takes, if you like, what it wants, what it considers to be its share of the revenue, and then decides who gets what is left. Now, ECG was the sole arbiter deciding what its share of the revenue was. So if they were supposed to collect 100 cedis, and their share or their costs were 20 cedis, but they only collected 40 cedis. So let's say they only collected 40% of what they were supposed to collect. If they still choose to retain the full 20 cedis that reflects their costs, then the whole remaining sector, which should have been sharing 80 cedis, is left with only 20 cedis to squabble over. And this has been happening over many years, and it has been progressively getting worse. What the cash waterfall did was to bring some visibility into how the insufficient funds were being shared. So the cash waterfall did two things. First of all, it showed us what proportion of the revenue requirement was actually hitting ECG's accounts. Now, we have to bear in mind that ECG reports revenue, but anyone who has done basic accounting will recognize that what is reported in the financial statements does not always reflect cash collected. Because if they bill somebody, they can say that it is revenue and it will show up in your financial statements. As to whether they ever actually collect that money or not, you'll have to dig deeper to find out. So what the cash waterfall did, it was looking purely at actual revenue accrued. Forget what they've billed, forget what they say they've collected, what cash was actually received into ECG accounts. And that money was shared according to the ratio of the tariff. So if they collected 10%, everybody gets 10%. If they collect 20%, everybody gets 20%. What that meant is that ECG went from, if you like, keeping as much as they deemed fit to only keeping what was their share of whatever they collected. Now, you hear ECG complaining that it's not enough for them to run their distribution
But
system.
isn't that a valid point, though?
It is, but what about the others? What about Gridco? Are we saying that they were okay before? Are we saying that the generation companies were okay before? Nobody has enough money to run the system.
That's a very important
person. Yes.
That's a very important point. I mean, so ECG needs its, of course, they collect, right?
Yeah.
And Doc is making a very important point. So it is valid, it says, that ECG is keeping some, but everybody else also wants their share.
So the way out then become a burden sharing arrangement, which is what
Exactly.
I think I agree with Dr. Nidakun, that the cash waterfall mechanism was established, one, for transparency purposes, but also for equity purposes. So you ensure that everybody carries a fair share of the burden. And I think this is where ECG perhaps didn't act right. Because look, nobody, as he makes the point, nobody is getting enough to run their businesses. So why should you be comfortable and the rest be uncomfortable?
You know, I mean, looking at the numbers again, it is clear that trajectory that they've been on since last year, when Habtel fully plugged in, it's going to continue.
Right.
I mean, because I saw the 2024 numbers, projections now projected to reach some 20 billion or so there in terms of the revenues coming in, all on the back of that Habtel intervention. Of course, the tariffs also kick in fully this year. So you're expecting huge amounts to come in on the back of that. Do you expect anything to change in terms of how much is then available for everybody else to share? On the back of the work that, that private player that you mentioned, Habtel had sort of put in?
Of course, if the cash waterfall mechanism is to work as intended, And if we are going to have every revenue mobilized by ECG accounted for, of course, we need to understand that if ECG is not able to operate, the monies won't come in. So, of course, we need to make some allowance to enable ECG to be able to carry its operations out. But once you take care of what ECG needs, not fully though, but reasonably, then of course there will be enough in the kitty to go around everybody else. I think it's important. I will not discount ECG's claim that it needs to provide for its operations, because it is ECG that is bringing in the money to be shared among everybody else. So you need to make sure that at least he has something, a decent amount, to cover its operational cost.
But I guess, fundamentally, you must first fix the revenue loopholes.
Yeah.
Because that's fundamental.
Which is being done now.
Okay.
And we see the revenue growing by the month. And so at least if things work out as projected, going into the future, we see more revenue coming in. I think the question really here is accountability. How is the monies that are coming in being accounted for, and how are they being shared to address the issue of equity in terms of relief to all the partners in the...
I mean, Doc, do you agree with that? That if you look at the projections, their revenues will grow even much more from that last year, and that a question of equity then comes in, sharing for everybody else who, of course, needs their in that value chain to get as much as they deserve from the increased revenue coming in?
So first of all, I must admit I question the figures in their financial statements. I'm not one to just trust that all the money that we see, the 85% is actually cash and not some accruals in there. So first of all, that would need to be interrogated. I haven't looked at it. But certainly, and also the other thing where I would question is the impact of the HAPTEL as compared to the impact of the tariff increase. I think you missed out the major tariff increase that happened in 2022, because soon after that tariff increase, remember that ECG had a meltdown. That was when they had their ransomware attack. So we didn't see the tariff increase feeding in until we got more or less to 2023. So you do need to add the major tariff increase of over 27% to the numbers that you've calculated.
But there's another point there that's important, right? Because just before the HAPTEL plugin, and if you speak to those who were there, is when those internal at the ECG knew that the DAC trace and things that will be implemented would have exposed the theft.
I will not discount the HAPTEL. I'm just saying you have to be measured about how much credit we give to the HAPTEL. It certainly had an impact, but one, I would question whether necessarily the 81% is cash. And secondly, I would say you need to look at the major tariff increase to then see to what extent it contributed. That being said, yes, the revenue has increased. We expect it to increase. What I'm not clear upon is whether the revenue has increased beyond the proportion of the tariff increment. Because to maintain what was a woeful collection rate of 6% in 2021 and 2022, to go beyond the 40% and start crossing 50, 60%, then you'd really be seeing that they have made a benefit. But just talking cash is not the answer. You need to look at how much they collected compared to how much they should have collected. And that's the real measure of improvement. I know ECG likes to talk, we increased our revenue collection by 85%. But if you increase your revenue by 85% when the tariff has gone up by 90%, you've actually reduced your revenue. So you'll need to make that calculation again and compare with what was supposed to be collected. Now, having said all that, my main contention is that ECG was bleeding. They were used to a certain level of revenue. That was not coming. It was long known that they would sort of rebel, and they did. They rebelled and they got support from certain elements, which meant that the cash waterfall formula had to be changed. Unfortunately for them, the way they pushed for it to be changed actually made the formula more reflective of the cost, and their take actually went down rather than up. And that is why they are not complying. It's a bottom line that they want more money than they are getting. The cash waterfall is not giving it to them. so they are not complying with the cash waterfall.
Yeah.
That's the bottom.
And that is an important point. And I'm showing you that trajectory there. And of course, Doc has made the point about the cash. Is everything cash or not? But the trajectory, though, shows that whatever they are collecting, and he makes the point, yes, there has been that improvement. It needs to be strengthened, I guess, is the point that we're making. Yeah. And I was making a point at the beginning that whatever they were doing, they did in 2023, you need to do more of, not less of. Because you want the trajectory to continue to the point where even if it's not cash, it's now coming in, right? Eventually, and hitting the bottom line and creating a significant positive in what everybody else is getting. Why is this important? Because that's how you keep the lights on, right? That's how you keep the lights on. The question I have for you, Doc, is how do you keep this trajectory of growth in revenue? Because you see, in the past,
no, I think
there have been some interventions, but it hasn't been sustained, right? They're doing something well, at least since last year, and you're seeing the projection that it's going to grow. How do you sustain that over a longer period to the point where you begin to see real impact on your bottom line?
I think a number of things have happened. The capital intervention is one. There's also, which linked to that is the cashless transactions at ECG these days.
But that cashless is also because of the capital fundamentally.
Exactly, so linked to that, yes. So, and then you have, what do you call it, revenue assurance from capital again, and the aggressive mobilization of revenues. We saw instances where even the airport, parliament had to be disconnected. And as soon as they were disconnected, they made some payment and all that. So those aggressive revenue mobilization is something that must continue. Again, I know ECG, I don't know if they've completed that exercise, but they shortlisted about 6 companies to be able to assemble the meters here locally, and so they can be delivered. So people who need meters can access them easily, because if you don't have meters, how do you bill and therefore collect the revenue? So metering becomes a very important element in the equation. And I think they are trying to deal with that, and we need to make sure that we put more effort at that. Again, we need to standardize the meters. We know the meters read differently. You can fix one meter on the one property, it reads differently. You put another one, it reads differently, even though the consumption remains the same.
You know, Dubik tried to solve that problem before he left. I mean, I had an interview with him where he acknowledged that the problem was. So they had to now begin a process of trying to build their own local meters of a sort, trying to standardize them across the board. I don't know where they got to before, of course, he had to resign.
Yeah, that's right. That's the one I was pointing to. There were 6 companies that were shortlisted to assemble the meters locally. That will provide jobs, but also ensure that there is easy availability of the meters when you need them, so that at least the metering of consumers would be faster than it used to be. And all these things, we're not too sure where they are, but we think that we must do more of those. So it's a multiplicity of factors and measures taken by the Dubik-led administration. I think we need to do a bit more of those.
Yeah, I want to take a quick break. When I return, we'll wrap up on this point. I mean, revenue is so key, and that's why we're having this conversation. Our light being on is fundamentally anchored on ECG's ability to sort of keep this trajectory going for a longer period. When I come out, my guest will wrap up for me. I'll get the thoughts of, Doc also on the subject of how do you sustain this growth to the point where the cash actually comes in into the kitty for everybody else to share. Stay with me. And you're still here live here on PM Express having a conversation about the revenue situation with the ECG. Remember that the Sono Asogli plant is still down. It's down, and we've been checking. We wanted them to come on the show to have a conversation. They said, well, they're waiting for some money to come in. If that money comes in, then they'll have a conversation. They didn't come, and I want to assume that because that money didn't come in, and so the plant remains shut. Dr. Need Darko Asante is a former PULC board member. In the studio with me is Dr. Steve Mateo, analyzing everything that is happening with the ECG. And Doc, very briefly, and because you just have a couple of minutes, in a minute, if you may, What should the PRC approach be to this challenge?
I think the first thing is to really get a handle of what is really going on. As I said, I'm not convinced that ECGs are affecting. I see your, like I said, I see your percentage increase. I am not convinced that it reflects ECG actually achieving anything positive. And for me, the bottom line is that if the top is not managing to do what needs to be done, the first thing is to signal that it's not good enough. Dubic is gone. The question is, whoever comes next must be read, if you like, what we call the route act. And she should know that he has X number of months to turn the ship around. If not, he also goes. That's the only way to change it, because it's people, it's leadership that makes the change. Let me just point out that Netco has the same problem. And I can tell you, Netco has made improvements in its collection. It may not have used a big software tool, but it has made changes. We need to look at what Netco is doing because they are being successful.
Okay.
ECG, the last time I checked, they were not being successful.
Yeah, and so that is one of the reasons why in the financials, though, for 2023, that is something, obviously, that if you want to replicate, in terms of looking at the cash value of that, something needs to happen to exponentially grow that. And the projection is that it will reach 20 billion this year in terms of the application that they sort of rolled out. For the PRC, what can they do?
I think PRC needs to assert itself more. And they've been doing that lately, but it was clear, it was evident that there was some pushback. And perhaps I want to believe that some political backing, perhaps for the Dubic, may have caused the inability for PRC to be able to flex its muscles better than it did. And so with the current terrain that we have, I think you want to see PRC strengthening its oversight capability over the industry players and ensuring that at least there's full accountability for whatever is collected. But having done that, we also need to take into account the concerns of ECG. I cannot stress that enough. That
you can dismiss
they need to be able to operate, to bring in the money, and therefore we need to be mindful not to sacrifice the revenues they need to be able to operate efficiently, to bring in the money so that it can be shared equitably.
Yeah, and Doc obviously makes a point about making sure that what is being reported actually reflects in their bottom line, right?
Certainly.
Which obviously is a key point there. And if you look at you drill down to the mobile app, for example, the mobile app is how much money is coming to the mobile app versus what is the ECG collecting. And the data that I see there shows that if you use the app, it improves collection because you're taking the human element out of that significantly. And that has, so we are all customers of ECG. So we know when there's convenience, right? You sit at home, my lights go off at midnight. All I need to do is use the app and my lights come back. So I don't know how it happens, but it happens.
Exactly.
So when I, for example, look at that data that talks about a mobile app, for example, this year, it used to be around some 40 million. It's gone up to almost 200 million just the same month, if you like, in January. That is significant. It's about sustaining that over a long period of time, then for it to become more useful for people.
Oh, yes,
of course. For the value chain.
The intervention certainly has enhanced customer experience. And I think these days, even getting a meter is not as difficult as it is or used to be. And so I think there's certainly some improvement, not only in the revenue, but in the quality of service you receive. Especially having taken out the human element. I recall before the Haptel intervention, there were sabotage. People were set up in the ECG system. I mean, what do you call it? Mobile credit vendors were set up in the system, and these revenues from these, fraudulent transactions were going into private pockets. Today, all those have been eliminated, and so it wasn't surprised that they reflected in some increase in revenue. And so taking out the human interface does not only assure revenue, but also improves customer satisfaction. So if you're asking me, Where should the emphasis be? What should we be doing more going into the future? I say the things that have brought improvement in the customer experience are the kinds of things that you want to do more of, because the frustrations people went through in the past led to illegal connections and all manner of things that resulted in revenue leakages. And so once you are arresting that, you want to do more of that to reduce the leakages.
And the question, I don't know whether they've given us the answer yet, that deliberate internal sabotage that crashed the entire ECG system the days before the Haptel plugging, because people knew that they were going to be. I don't know what has happened to these, and maybe they've been found. I know National Security went in and did some work investigating, because they're going to be caught. I know they introduced the DAC trace to try and wipe people out and trace them, and so shut it down, ban it completely. So you sort of destroy all traces of, of interference in the system. Look, enjoy the rest of your evening. As for the ECG question, we need to follow up on the Sona Sogli shutdown a bit more. As we know now, they're still down. They are still waiting to be paid. Once we get the very latest on that, we'll bring it up to you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Week. When